All right, everybody, time to do another chat. Previously, I was talking about cloud adoption, and I started sort of talking about DevOps as a methodology that can be used to help you accelerate your path to the cloud. And that's something that might not be understood well. So I want to touch on this point a little bit today. And we're going to talk about how DevOps can help you with your transition to the cloud. So DevOps as a methodology is just basically taking your developers and systems operations and combining those teams, flattening the barriers between those teams so that they can deploy applications in a very, very quick manner. And the ethos of DevOps is, it's basically, you build an application, you run the application. You build it, you run it, right? Now, why is that so important? Well, if you think about it, if you write an application, then who better to run that application than yourself? Because you know the internals, you know what a certain type of usage pattern will mean on your application. Let's say you got high CPU consumption and you say, oh, but we're not using any calls or methods or anything like that would spike the CPU at this point, so there must be something wrong in there, right? Whereas a sysadmin who doesn't know the internals of the application, looking at high CPU spike, might just say, okay, we need to provision more capacity. That's the idea, right? Because you understand the application, you run it very efficiently. Now, efficiency is crucial when you come to cloud, because when you are in the cloud, you're going to be consuming services for which you pay per use. So the less you use for a certain function, the more efficient you are, the less it'll cost you to run your application. This is where sort of DevOps makes a lot of sense. Now, there is a term called DevSecOps, right? Where it's using DevOps as a methodology for your security teams, or integrating security into your DevOps process. Now, both of those make no sense to me personally, and I personally do not use the word DevSecOps, because if you don't do security, you are not doing DevOps. If you are building, running, and updating your application, you should also be responsible for the security of your application. There is no concept where you can make a DevOps application that doesn't include security, in my mind. Now, of course, because of segmentation, you might have a DevOps process, but you still might have a development, SysOps, and security department in your company, and they might have to work together. And you know, sort of DevSecOps gives that security emphasis into the process, and they might build teams from the developer department, from the SysOps department, and the security department to work together. But I think the word sec, the security part, is completely redundant, because a DevOps process that does not do security on the application is not a fully functional DevOps process. You run it, you build it, you run it, means you run it securely. You don't just build it and run it and then open all the ports and hope that, you know, that's just gonna work, no problem. When we're talking about cloud adoption, DevOps helps first with, you know, one of the core pillars of DevOps is automation. DevOps by itself is more of a methodology on with respects to breaking down barriers than actually introducing some kind of tool set, right? Although we call it a DevOps tool chain, it most likely falls more under CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, right? And you can run CI/CD without having a DevOps culture inside of your environment. Yeah, it's harder, because if you've got a very strict, walled, siloed environment where everybody just, throws the application over the wall and nobody talks to each other, then it's hard to do CI/CD, but it's not impossible to do CI/CD. So equating DevOps with CI/CD is kind of wrong, because DevOps does not necessarily mean you're using CI/CD, right? You might have some other methodology in the back end that complies with the goals of DevOps. It's just that CI/CD and DevOps really overlap well, so it's kind of now one is the synonym for the other almost, although they're not. Typically you will find three different things, right? First, you've got Agile, which is just the practices of development, the practices of how you structure your development, how you do the meetings, how you do the organization of your tasks and everything, right? That's Agile. Then forming teams is DevOps, and making sure that the teams are flat, and the culture of the development process is, a one-to-one relationship where everybody just says, whatever is on their mind. Use a candid approach to just, tell the truth to everybody, not beat around the bush and try to, not really convey the message. That's DevOps. And then the tool set itself usually is going to be CI/CD, because it fits well, right? And the CI/CD is the one that prescribes, okay, you need to have these types of environments set up for fast continuous integration and fast continuous deployment. And we'll touch on CI/CD later in another chapter, because CI/CD itself is, it's a huge sort of area to talk about. So how does that relate to cloud? Well, agility allows us to essentially figure out the cloud much faster than if we have a traditional get a purchase order and then get it signed and etc. process. Because sometimes you're in an enterprise environment, that if you make a change, you could save potentially thousands of dollars on an application, but you can't make that change because of the version management process. The change management process doesn't allow you to do it, right? Because of the prescribed rules inside of the business that say, okay, when you make a change, you got to document it, you got to give a reason, you got to go through the whole testing process, you got to make sure the testing process is completed before you send it to the QA process, etc., etc. If you have a traditional waterfall approach for your SDLC, then it might take weeks or months to implement a small change. And that's where sometimes we get stuck with a lot of businesses that say, oh yeah, we want to adopt cloud, but then their internal structure is so rigid that it takes them years to get their application into the cloud, right? And the less rigid your internal structure is, the less rigid your management, the less rigid your organizational approach, the less rigid your culture in your business is, the more you're willing to go towards a dynamic approach, the faster you're going to be able to adopt the cloud. So instead of years, you can do cloud adoption in weeks. Literally, you can cut that time down to weeks. Weeks is sort of the minimum. Again, you have to have the underlying education and underlying understanding of the features before you can start consuming them. That's key here. And it might take weeks in the beginning to even get your people educated, to get them up to spec, to the level of understanding that you need to run your application in the cloud. Now, how do we approach this? Well, when I do cloud adoption consulting, I usually insist on two things, right? First thing is, we get everybody to a certain level that they need to be at, right? We sort of build a skills map, whatever the approach is. Some like to use Kaizen, some just like to use their typical DevOps approaches. You build a skill map, and you say everybody needs to be above this level on the skill map before we try anything, right? And that level will be completely different depending on what kind of applications you run, right? Some businesses will need a detailed understanding of serverless technologies, where others, who are basically in the virtualization stage, just need to understand how virtualization will work in the cloud, how failover works, how high availability works, how you can deploy your applications in the cloud before they're ready to start adopting, before they're ready to just start to lift and shift the applications. And once you got the skills map, the second thing I always insist on is always allow your employees to experiment, right? Give them an account, give them a sandbox where they can go in and play around with services and just figure out how it works, right? That's the two crucial things that you need. You don't need certification. Yes, it's great to have certification, right? You don't need to attend a course. Yes, it's great to attend a course because a course can really speed up the learning process, right? They get a focused, condensed version of weeks of searching and reading through the public documents at the cloud provider side, right? And a lot of students also combine that. They pick up a book, a cert guide or something like that, they go to a class, and they also explore public documents, which is great. But without hands-on, this knowledge that you're absorbing is gonna get lost. What I suggest to all my students is, you're in a class today. Think of this class as like group consulting, right? You should have a certain level of knowledge where you're prepared to ask questions. And then after you're out of the class, immediately on Monday, start using the technology. And they tell me, well, our business doesn't really give us access to any cloud environment. We can't really get any resources. I mean, that kind of business, and this is like 80% of the businesses out there. Why? You're, paying these people a lot of money and just giving them $200 a month on a cloud provider or multiple cloud provider accounts is too much, right? Think of this expense as a business expense like you would think of a computer, a laptop. You give them a laptop, you give them a laptop allowance, whatever. Also give them a cloud allowance. This is for the managers. Give your people a cloud allowance, right? Something that they can take and spend on any cloud and just experiment. For $100, you can do a ton of stuff at any cloud provider. Most cloud providers will give you a free tier, right? For Azure and Google, you actually have a number. You have like $300 that you get for free, and you can just use them for anything. With AWS, it's a little bit more complicated. They've got free tier, and in the billing, you don't really know whether you're in the free tier or not. You have to monitor that carefully. And that is a crucial part of learning, is getting the hands-on experience, especially when this is something that you will be doing in 3 weeks time, in 2 months time, whenever, right? Now, there's always a question, well, our people don't really have time to play around. Why? Why don't they have time to learn about the product that they will be using for possibly the next decade, or products that they will be using for possibly in the next decade? Or this is a long-term plan. A cloud migration is like, think about it as, we're building a data center. We're not building it for the next 3 months. We're building it for the next 10 years. Using the cloud is your next data center. It's your 10-year project, and you're not allowing people to do that work. Now, a lot of these sort of new age tech companies, they have passion projects, right? Passion projects where you can spend 20% of the time working on anything you like, as long as it's sort of related to your job. there's your time to experiment. Doesn't need to be 20% at a time. It can be 10% at a time. Give them some time. Tell them, like, look, this is the time that you're putting in. Here's an hour a day where you can just experiment. Do whatever you want, right? Or sometimes when we already have Agile or DevOps implemented and we have sprints, right? The sprint is sort of a development cycle where you take some tasks, you integrate them, and by the end of the sprint, they should mostly be built, right? So what we like to do is, if it's a fast development process, I like to suggest 4-day sprints. Like, typically a company will say, yeah, a weekly sprint is 5 days. You have 5 days to work on it. You start on Monday and you finish on Friday. Well, I like to suggest a 4-day sprint, because a 4-day sprint makes it easy to use Friday, to use the last day of the week for things like game days, for experimenting, for building off any kind of new environment, for you know, whatever. Day 5 is just, and that's your 20%. And the other option, the other option is if it's a multi-week sprint. And you know, some businesses will say we've got a sprint that lasts usually 2 weeks or 3 weeks or even a month. A month is not a sprint anymore, right? So you either have weekly or bi-weekly sprints. That works really well. When it's a really big application, bi-weekly sprints, when it's bigger pieces that need to be integrated and that they take a long time to integrate, bi-weekly sprints are very useful. What we try to do is we try to make them fill out the first 5 days with as much work as possible, and then do, you know, things that take a long time, like for example performance testing or vulnerability checks or something like that over the weekend. You know, just let it pass through the automated environment. Do the big test over the weekend, right? Do your nightlies every evening, which you would do anyway, but over the weekend, take those 2 days and do the big test, whatever the big test is, production rollout test, whatever, right? Set those up, and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you can do things like bug fixing, you can do things like tuning the process for the actual deployment, and then Thursday, Friday is the 20%, right? And typically Thursday is then still used for some kind of work, and then Friday falls into the 10%. But at least give your people at least 10% of the time to do other stuff, to experiment, to build off, to, you know, make sure that they know about the products, make sure that they know about the next generation of stuff. Just keeping track with the new stuff coming out is sometimes really difficult, right? As instructors of these products, like, it is really difficult to handle one cloud environment, let alone 2 or 3. So this is where it sort of gets to a point where you have to sort of decide what your focus is, right? And then it's kind of weird, because in cloud you have to be sort of, you have to understand everything. You have to understand your network connectivity, you get to understand your servers, your storage, your caching, your databases, your messaging, your, you know, all kinds of stuff. You need to understand all of those components to a pretty high degree before you're ready to deploy. But then on the other hand, I'm telling you, this is at a certain point you'll have to specialize, right? You need to strike a good balance between those two. All right, so the point here is DevOps, Agile, CI/CD approach, they can be really good to help you speed up your cloud adoption. One thing that you can do is, with a fast iterating process, you can quickly learn how your automation works. You can quickly tune your automation. You can quickly efficiently design your future deployments, right? Sometimes the CI/CD process in the infrastructure is not really gonna deploy every time to production. It's just gonna deploy multiple proofs of concepts that are possible, and then on the actual proofs of concepts you can start analyzing which one would make most sense financially, which one would make more sense performance wise for your application. And your infrastructure CI/CD process might not be like your development CI/CD process where every version goes into production. With the infrastructure, it might just be deploying multiple proofs of concepts and doing multiple performance testing and cost analysis on the deployed products. And your production is sitting there on servers, your lift and shift production is sitting there, and once your CI/CD process discovers the best price performance ratio for the deployment, then you start implementing that into your application through the same process eventually. But in the beginning, there might be a lot of work, and there might be, you know, deliveries that are not tied to production. So that's something that also needs to be understood. CI/CD is also a continuous learning environment. You continuously learn about how your application works, how your infrastructure works, how services that you're consuming work at certain performance levels or at certain levels of calls that you make to that service, at certain parallel execution states, etc. Yeah, that's it. Run a dynamic environment, right? Adopt practices like Agile, DevOps, and CI/CD. Automate your infrastructure, and then experiment. That is it. Thank you for watching this one. I will see you in my next session. And in the next session, I'm planning to talk about CI/CD. So if you're interested in CI/CD, I will definitely be going very deep into the methodology itself, into the practice itself, not the actual tools. I'm not going to talk about insert your tool in here. I'm going to talk about the practice, how to make it better, and you know, how to make the most use of it. And that is it. Make sure to subscribe, and of course, if you want to support my videos, just like them on Facebook and write a comment, say, yeah, great stuff, or tell me what you don't like about it. That's also support, because I'm looking to improve these overall. Maybe I'm too long, maybe I take too much time to deliver these concepts to you, or maybe you'd want to hear something completely different. Not going to ask you for money. I'm not going to put commercials on this channel, and I'm not going to set up a Patreon page for this. Just like, subscribe, and comment. That's all you need to do to show your support. Thank you very much. I appreciate every subscription. I appreciate every like and every comment. And yeah, let's make this channel something really good. It's early on right now, and I'm just experimenting with what can be done. But yeah, let's help me make this channel much better than it is today. All right, as always, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next chapter of Walking on the Cloud with Marco. Bye.